When exactly will they return? Not if, not someday. When? That question has echoed through forgotten temples, buried libraries, desert ruins, and underground archives for thousands of years. Not asked by cult leaders or fanatics, but by historians, linguists, archaeologists, astronomers. People who spent their lives studying ancient texts carved into clay nearly 5,000 years ago. Texts that should not exist. Because the deeper researchers looked into the Sumerian tablets, the stranger the story became. The Sumerians were not supposed to know the things they knew. They were not supposed to appear so suddenly in history. They were not supposed to describe beings descending from the sky, bringing civilization, ruling humanity for immense spans of time, and then leaving with a promise to return. Yet the tablets remain. Quiet, cold, waiting. And tonight, we are going to follow that trail. But before we begin, if you enjoy slow deep dives into forgotten history, ancient mysteries, and theories hidden between myth and reality, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Southern Mesopotamia, roughly 6,000 years ago, long before Greece, before Rome, before Babylon rose to power. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something appeared that historians still struggle to explain. A civilization. Not slowly, not gradually, but almost all at once. The Sumerians emerged with writing already developed, complex mathematics already functioning, advanced irrigation systems already operating, monumental architecture already standing. Their cities, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, were not primitive settlements slowly evolving towards sophistication. They were sophisticated from the start. This is one of the strangest facts in all of ancient history. Normally, civilizations evolve in layers. Small villages become larger settlements. Simple tools become more advanced over centuries. Writing systems develop through countless imperfect stages. But in Sumer, history seems to accelerate violently, as if knowledge arrived already completed. Even respected historians admitted the mystery. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the most important Sumerian scholars of the 20th century, famously titled his book, "History Begins at Sumer." Because in many ways, it truly does. The first schools, the first legal codes, the first written astronomy, the first recorded kings, the first organized religion. And yet the Sumerians themselves claimed none of it originated with them. According to their own tablets, civilization was given to humanity by beings they called the Anunnaki, the ones who came from heaven to earth. That phrase alone has fueled nearly a century of controversy. Mainstream scholars interpret the Anunnaki as mythological deities, symbolic figures representing natural forces and political structures. Others believe something far stranger may lie behind the stories. Tonight, we are not here to blindly believe either side. We are here to examine the evidence, the real tablets, the real archaeological discoveries, the real texts preserved in museums around the world, and what they actually say. Because one document in particular changes everything. It is known as the Sumerian King List, a genuine artifact discovered in Iraq in the early 20th century. The most famous version, called the Weld Blundell Prism, is currently housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. At first glance, it looks simple enough, a list of kings. But the opening line is deeply unsettling. When kingship descended from heaven, descended, not invented, not established, descended. The text then lists rulers who supposedly governed for impossible spans of time. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000 years. According to conventional historians, these numbers are symbolic exaggerations, religious mathematics, mythological prestige, and that explanation may very well be correct. But here is where things become uncomfortable. The Sumerians were not writing poetry in these records. They were obsessive administrators. They documented grain distribution, taxation, land ownership, star movements, labor systems, and trade routes with astonishing precision. These were practical people, structured people. So why suddenly become wildly fantastical when discussing their earliest rulers? That question opened the door for alternative interpretations. In 1976, writer Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. In it, he argued that the Anunnaki were not symbolic gods at all, but actual beings connected to a massive celestial body called Nibiru. According to his interpretation, the enormous reign lengths in the king list reflected orbital cycles of this hidden planet. His ideas were heavily criticized by academic scholars. Many accused him of mistranslating ancient languages and forcing modern science fiction concepts onto ancient mythology. And to be fair, many professional Assyriologists reject Sitchin completely. But the strange thing is, even if every one of Sitchin's conclusions is wrong, the tablets themselves still exist. The texts are real, and the deeper people read them, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. Because the Anunnaki were never described as vague spiritual forces floating in the clouds. They had names, families, conflicts, ranks, cities, responsibilities. They traveled. They ruled. They fought wars. And according to multiple texts, they eventually left. But not forever. That is the detail many people overlook. The Sumerian records do not describe a permanent disappearance. Again and again, they describe cycles. Arrival, departure, return. And once you begin noticing that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. In Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in India, in ancient flood myths across the entire world. Different names, different cultures. But somehow, the same story. Civilization appears after mysterious teachers arrive from the heavens. Knowledge is given to humanity. A catastrophe follows. The gods depart. And one day, they return. For thousands of years, these stories were dismissed as fantasy. Then archaeology began uncovering ruins older than anyone expected. Astronomy began searching for hidden planets at the edge of the solar system. And geology began discovering evidence of catastrophic global events around the exact same period ancient civilizations described as the age before the flood. Slowly, the impossible began to feel less impossible. And that is where our journey truly begins. Because before we can ask whether the Anunnaki will return, we first need to understand who or what the Sumerians believed they were. The Sumerians believed the world before civilization was not empty. It was abandoned. That distinction matters, because according to the oldest Mesopotamian traditions, humanity did not slowly crawl out of ignorance toward progress. The world had already been shaped before recorded history truly began. Cities existed before kings. Knowledge existed before schools. Order existed before human governments. And at the center of that forgotten age stood the Anunnaki. To understand why these beings became so important, we first need to understand the strange worldview of the Sumerians themselves. Unlike modern people, the Sumerians did not separate religion from science, astronomy from mythology, or politics from cosmology. To them, everything was connected. The sky was not symbolic. The heavens were not abstract. They were locations, real places inhabited by real powers. This idea appears repeatedly throughout Sumerian literature. In tablet after tablet, the gods are described traveling between heaven and earth, issuing commands, establishing cities, assigning duties, and controlling the destiny of kings. One of the oldest and most important cities in all of Sumer was Eridu. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was not merely founded by humans. It was established by the god Enki himself. Enki was one of the central figures of the Anunnaki, a god of wisdom, water, creation, knowledge. But what makes Enki fascinating is how strangely practical he appears in the texts. He is not a distant spiritual abstraction. He builds things. He organizes systems, designs canals, teaches agriculture, controls engineering and craftsmanship. In some myths, he almost resembles an administrator, more than a deity. Another major figure was Enlil. Where Enki represented knowledge and creation, Enlil represented authority and command. He was associated with kingship, law, storms, and divine power. The relationship between Enki and Enlil becomes one of the defining tensions in Sumerian mythology. Again and again, the texts describe disagreements between them regarding humanity. Enlil often appears harsh, strict, unforgiving. Enki, meanwhile, repeatedly acts to protect humans. This conflict reaches its most famous form in the ancient flood stories. But before we get there, another text changes the entire discussion. A text known as Atrahasis. Preserved on clay tablets over 3,000 years old, Atrahasis contains one of the oldest surviving accounts of human creation. And the reason it unsettles modern readers is because of how specific it feels. The story begins with labor, not spiritual enlightenment, not divine love. Work. According to the text, lesser beings known as the Igigi were forced to perform exhausting labor for the higher gods. They dug canals, shaped the land, maintained the world itself. Eventually, the workers rebelled. They surrounded Enlil's dwelling. The gods panicked, and then Enki proposed a solution. Create another being to do the work instead. Humanity. In the tablet, the goddess Ninhursag mixes clay with the blood of a sacrificed divine being. From this mixture, humans are formed. The wording is strange, very strange, because the text repeatedly emphasizes combination, mixture, blending, essence transferred into matter. Some researchers have interpreted this symbolically. Others have gone much further. Zecharia Sitchin famously argued that the story reflected a primitive description of genetic engineering, the Anunnaki combining their own biology with early hominids to create a labor force. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation almost entirely, but even they acknowledge something important. The text itself genuinely describes humanity being intentionally manufactured for labor. That is not speculation. That is what the story says. And perhaps that explains why the Sumerian gods feel so different from later religious traditions. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as morally perfect beings. They become angry, jealous, fearful. They argue with one another. They make decisions that sound political rather than divine. At times they seem terrifyingly human. Or perhaps, humans seem terrifyingly similar to them. As centuries passed, the Sumerians expanded this divine hierarchy into a vast cosmic structure. Anu ruled the heavens. Enlil ruled the earth and atmosphere. Enki governed the deep waters and hidden wisdom. Other gods controlled war, fertility, storms, writing, death, astronomy, and kingship. Every city had its patron deity. Every ruler derived authority from heaven. But hidden beneath all of this mythology was a recurring idea that refuses to disappear. The gods were not originally here. They arrived. That detail appears over and over again in Mesopotamian literature. In some texts, they descend from heaven. In others, they establish settlements. In others, they divide territories among themselves. And eventually, they begin leaving. One of the most haunting examples appears in ancient lamentation texts written after catastrophic destructions of Sumerian cities. The Lament for Ur describes gods abandoning temples while cities collapse into ruin. The wording feels deeply emotional. The gods flee. The sacred places become empty. Civilization falls into chaos. But the texts never describe total extinction, only withdrawal, temporary absence. And that distinction becomes incredibly important later, because once the gods leave, humanity is forced to continue alone. Kings inherit authority once held directly by divine beings. Knowledge becomes fragmented. Empires rise and collapse. The idea of a hidden planet did not begin with modern conspiracy theories. It began with ancient clay. Thousands of tablets recovered from Mesopotamia contain references to celestial movements, divine cycles, and heavenly bodies moving through the sky according to fixed laws. Most of these texts are fragmented. Many remain untranslated even today. But scattered across them is a recurring concept that later researchers connected to a mysterious word: Nibiru. Few terms in ancient history have generated more controversy. In mainstream Assyriology, Nibiru is usually interpreted as a crossing point, a celestial marker, or sometimes another name for Jupiter, or a specific star associated with Babylonian astronomy. But Zechariah Sitchin proposed something far more radical. According to his interpretation, Nibiru was an actual planet, a massive world traveling on an elongated orbit far beyond the known planets, periodically returning to the inner solar system every several thousand years. And according to Sitchin, the Anunnaki came from there. Now, it is extremely important to say this clearly. Professional scholars overwhelmingly reject Sitchin's translations. Linguists such as Michael Heiser spent years criticizing his work, arguing that he misunderstood or deliberately distorted ancient terminology. That criticism is real and serious. But what keeps the debate alive is not simply Sitchin himself. It is the strange overlap between ancient descriptions and modern astronomical mysteries. Because while scholars argued over translations, astronomers quietly began searching for something unusual at the edge of the solar system. In January of 2016, two astrophysicists from Caltech, Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown, published research suggesting that the strange orbits of distant objects beyond Neptune could only be explained by the gravitational influence of an undiscovered massive planet. They called it Planet 9. Not Nibiru, not a home world of ancient gods, simply a mathematical possibility. But the details immediately caught people's attention. A large planetary body, extremely distant, moving on a highly elongated orbit, taking thousands of years to complete a single cycle around the sun. Sound familiar? The proposed orbit of Planet 9 is far larger than the one described by Sitchin, and no serious astronomer claims they are the same object. But the coincidence unsettled people nonetheless, because for decades, critics mocked the very idea that a hidden massive body could exist in the outer solar system. Now, modern astrophysics was openly searching for one, and the deeper scientists looked into the outer darkness. The stranger things became. Beyond Neptune lies a frozen region filled with icy objects drifting through deep space. Some of these objects move in bizarre synchronized patterns that should not naturally occur. Something appears to be influencing them gravitationally. Something unseen. Batygin and Brown estimated that if Planet 9 exists, it could have a mass several times larger than Earth. But despite powerful telescopes scanning the skies, it still has not been directly observed. It remains hypothetical, a shadow inferred through mathematics. And perhaps that is what makes the story so psychologically powerful. Because hidden things terrify people more than visible ones, especially when ancient civilizations seemed obsessed with the sky. The Sumerians tracked celestial movements with extraordinary dedication. Their priests observed stars night after night, generation after generation, recording cycles with almost obsessive precision. Why? Partly for agriculture, partly for religion, but perhaps also because they believed something important would eventually return. This idea appears indirectly in multiple Mesopotamian traditions. One particularly fascinating example comes from the Prophecy of Marduk. This text describes the god Marduk leaving Babylon and later returning after periods of chaos and destruction. The language is cyclical, repetitive, departure, absence, return, again and again. Most historians interpret this politically, symbolic language connected to invasions, exiles, and restoration of temples. and that interpretation is completely reasonable. But alternative researchers noticed something else: the repeated timing patterns, the association between celestial events and historical collapse, the idea that catastrophic changes on Earth occurred alongside heavenly cycles. That connection becomes even more disturbing when we examine geological evidence. Because around 12,800 years ago, Earth experienced something catastrophic: a sudden climate shift known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted rapidly, massive flooding reshaped coastlines, entire ecosystems collapsed, many large animal species vanished, and according to one controversial scientific hypothesis, the disaster may have been triggered by fragments of a comet or other celestial impact. Evidence for this theory includes unusual layers of microscopic diamonds, melted particles, and impact materials discovered across multiple continents. Then, in 2018, researchers announced the discovery of a gigantic crater buried beneath the ice of Greenland. A crater large enough to support the possibility of a catastrophic cosmic impact around the same ancient period. Not all scientists agree on the interpretation. Debates continue. But once again, the timing becomes difficult to ignore, because this same period overlaps with another archaeological mystery: Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone complex in modern Turkey, dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than Sumer itself. Its builders were supposedly hunter-gatherers, yet they created enormous carved pillars weighing many tons, arranged in sophisticated ceremonial circles with astronomical alignments and intricate animal carvings. And then something even stranger happened. The entire site was intentionally buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, carefully covered, as though preserved for the future. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations, admitted the site challenged conventional history itself. Because according to the traditional timeline, civilization wasn't supposed to exist at this level yet. But there it was, stone by stone. Silent proof that human history may be far older and far stranger than previously believed. This is where theories surrounding the Anunnaki begin pulling together multiple mysteries into a single narrative: ancient advanced knowledge, sudden civilization, global catastrophe, the departure of gods, the promise of return. Does this prove the existence of extraterrestrial beings? No, absolutely not. But it creates something perhaps more dangerous than proof: a pattern. And human beings are deeply affected by patterns, especially ancient ones. Especially patterns repeated across continents, by cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. Because the Sumerians were not the only civilization waiting for returning gods. The Egyptians believed divine rulers once walked among humans during a lost age called Zep Tepi, the first time. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl departed across the sea with a promise to return. In Hindu tradition, advanced beings descended during previous world ages before disappearing as humanity declined. In Norse mythology, the gods vanish after catastrophe, but eventually return after Ragnarok. Different civilizations, different languages, yet strangely, the same structure. Teachers arrive from the heavens. Civilization begins. A great catastrophe occurs. The gods leave. And one day, they come back. For most of history, these similarities were dismissed as coincidence or psychological archetypes. But as archaeology uncovered older ruins, as astronomy searched for hidden worlds, as geology revealed evidence of forgotten catastrophes, the old stories stopped sounding entirely impossible. And that is precisely what makes them so unsettling. Because maybe the greatest fear hidden inside these ancient myths is not that the gods once came to Earth, but that humanity was told to expect them again. If the Anunnaki truly existed, where did they go? That question haunted ancient civilizations long before modern researchers began debating Nibiru, hidden planets, or extraterrestrial visitors. because according to the oldest Mesopotamian traditions, the gods did not die. They departed. And the details surrounding that departure are some of the most disturbing passages in all ancient literature. To understand them, we need to return to one event that appears almost everywhere in ancient mythology: the flood. Not just in the Bible, not just in Mesopotamia. Flood myths exist in hundreds of cultures across the planet, from India to South America, from China to Scandinavia. Civilizations separated by oceans somehow preserved memories of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the world of an earlier age. Most historians explain this through regional flooding events combined with mythological exaggeration. And that explanation may absolutely be correct. But once again, the strange thing is the consistency. The same core structure repeats over and over. A warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, divine beings fleeing or withdrawing, civilization restarting afterward. The Sumerian version appears in multiple texts, but its most famous form survives inside the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works ever discovered. The tablets describing it were found in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh during the 19th century. When translated, scholars were stunned, because embedded inside the epic was a flood narrative astonishingly similar to the biblical story of Noah. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian tradition, that a catastrophic flood is coming. He is instructed to build a massive vessel, to preserve life, to survive while the world is destroyed. But hidden inside the story is a detail many people miss. The gods themselves are terrified. In several translations of the text, the deities flee upward during the disaster. They retreat into heaven. One passage describes them cowering like frightened animals as the flood consumes the earth below. That wording is strange, because gods are usually portrayed as controlling disasters, not escaping from them. And yet the tablets repeatedly emphasize withdrawal, retreat, departure. Some researchers interpret this symbolically, representing cosmic order collapsing into chaos. Others see something much more literal, a memory of advanced beings abandoning Earth during a global catastrophe. Again, there is no proof, only patterns. But those patterns become more unsettling when connected to real geological evidence, because the end of the last ice age truly was catastrophic. Sea levels rose dramatically. Entire coastlines disappeared beneath water. Ancient settlements may now lie buried beneath the oceans. In fact, during the Ice Age, humans could walk across vast regions now completely submerged. The Persian Gulf itself, where Sumerian civilization later emerged, may once have been a fertile inhabited basin, before flooding transformed it forever. Some archaeologists even speculate that memories of these flooding events survived through oral tradition for thousands of years, before eventually being written into myth. If true, then the flood stories may preserve fragments of real prehistoric trauma. But for the Sumerians, the flood was not simply a natural disaster. It marked the boundary between two worlds, the age before and the age after. This distinction appears clearly in the Sumerian king list. Before the flood, kings rule for impossible lengths of time. After the flood, lifespans collapse dramatically. Civilization changes. The divine order weakens. The gods become more distant, almost as though something fundamental had ended. And according to certain interpretations, that was exactly the moment the Anunnaki left. But not all at once. Some texts suggest certain gods remained involved with humanity long after the catastrophe, particularly Enki. Unlike Enlil, who often appears cold and punitive, Enki repeatedly helps humans survive. He warns Utnapishtim about the flood. He protects knowledge. He intervenes against destruction. This has led some alternative researchers to frame the Anunnaki not as unified rulers, but as divided factions with conflicting intentions regarding humanity. One side controlling, the other protective. Whether symbolic or literal, that tension gives the stories a surprisingly modern psychological quality. The gods behave less like omnipotent spiritual beings, and more like competing powers managing an unstable civilization. Perhaps that is why the myths continue to feel strangely believable. Not scientifically believable, emotionally believable. Because the world itself often feels governed by forces beyond ordinary human control. Empires rise suddenly, civilizations collapse unexpectedly, knowledge appears and disappears, and history repeatedly suffers catastrophic resets. This idea becomes even more chilling when connected to another ancient mystery. Why do so many civilizations describe earlier ages as more advanced than their own? The Greeks spoke of lost golden ages. The Egyptians referred to the first time. Hindu cosmology describes previous cycles of humanity destroyed and renewed. Even Plato's story of Atlantis may preserve echoes of this same pattern, an advanced civilization erased by catastrophe. Modern culture tends to imagine progress as linear, primitive past, advanced future. But ancient cultures often imagined the opposite, that humanity was declining, forgetting, moving further away from a lost age of knowledge. And perhaps nowhere is that fear more visible than in the ruins humanity left behind. Because scattered across the planet are structures that continue to challenge conventional explanations. Massive stones weighing hundreds of tons, precise astronomical alignments, engineering feats difficult even for modern technology. One of the most famous examples stands in Lebanon. Baalbek. Beneath the Roman temples lies a foundation constructed from colossal stone blocks, weighing up to 800 tons each. Nearby, archaeologists discovered even larger unfinished stones, still resting in the quarry. One estimated at over 1,600 tons. To this day, no fully satisfying explanation exists for how ancient builders moved such objects with primitive technology. Engineers proposed systems of rollers, ramps, manpower, and levers. And technically, it may have been possible. But the deeper question remains: why? Why use stones of such absurd size at all? Alternative theorists like Sitchin proposed an extraordinary answer, that Baalbek functioned as a kind of ancient landing platform connected to the Anunnaki. Mainstream archaeology rejects this idea entirely. Yet the mystery of the site remains unresolved enough to keep speculation alive. And Baalbek is not alone. The Nazca lines in Peru stretch across the desert in enormous geometric forms, visible primarily from the sky. Göbekli Tepe predates known civilization by thousands of years. The Great Pyramid aligns with celestial precision still debated today. Individually, each mystery may eventually receive ordinary explanations. But collectively, they create a growing sense that ancient humanity may have possessed knowledge modern civilization still does not fully understand. Which brings us back to the central fear hidden inside the Sumerian texts. Because if the Anunnaki did leave after the flood, why did so many traditions insist they would one day return? And perhaps even more unsettling, what if humanity has been unconsciously waiting for that return ever since? Humanity has always feared the sky, not because of what it reveals, but because of what may return from it. For the ancient Sumerians, the heavens were not empty space filled with distant stars. They were active territory, a structured realm inhabited by powers capable of shaping civilization itself. And according to their texts, those powers operated in cycles. Everything returned eventually. Kingship, disaster, floods, planets, gods. That idea of cosmic repetition sits at the center of Mesopotamian thought. One of the most important Sumerian concepts was the Shar, a vast cycle of time connected to celestial order. Later researchers, especially Zecharia Sitchin, linked the Shar to the orbital period of Nibiru. 3,600 years. One enormous cosmic cycle. Mainstream scholars strongly dispute this interpretation, but even outside Sitchin's theories, The Sumerians clearly viewed time differently than modern civilization does. To them, history was not linear. It moved in repeating patterns. Rise, collapse, renewal, again and again. This becomes deeply unsettling when paired with real astronomical cycles discovered much later. One example is the precession of Earth's axis, a slow wobble in Earth's rotation, causing the stars to gradually shift position over thousands of years. The complete cycle takes approximately 25,920 years. The astonishing part is that ancient civilizations may have known about it. Not only the Sumerians, but Egyptians, Hindus, and even certain Mesoamerican traditions appear to encode long celestial cycles into mythology and architecture. How? That question still has no definitive answer. Because detecting precession requires observations spanning enormous periods of time, far longer than a single human life, which means either ancient civilizations inherited sophisticated astronomical traditions from much older cultures, or they possessed systems of observation far more advanced than historians once believed. Both possibilities are uncomfortable, especially when combined with another strange reality. Modern science increasingly acknowledges that Earth experiences periodic catastrophe, mass extinctions, comet impacts, magnetic reversals, climate collapses. Civilization feels permanent while we are living inside it. But geology tells a different story. Entire worlds vanish, and sometimes they vanish quickly. The Younger Dryas event around 12,800 years ago may be one such example. An abrupt cooling period triggered, possibly, by extraterrestrial impact fragments striking Earth. The consequences were devastating. Massive floods, environmental collapse, disruption of human populations across continents. Some researchers believe this catastrophe became the origin of the Great Flood myths, later preserved by ancient civilizations. Others suggest something even more disturbing, that the disaster marked the collapse of a forgotten advanced culture existing before recorded history. A civilization erased so completely that only fragmented memories survived inside myth. If that idea sounds impossible, consider this. For most of modern history, scholars believed civilization began roughly 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Then, Göbekli Tepe was discovered. Suddenly organized monumental construction existed 12,000 years ago. History doubled overnight. What else remains buried? What else has not yet been uncovered? The deeper archaeology digs into the ancient world, the less stable the traditional timeline begins to feel. And perhaps that instability explains why stories about the Anunnaki continue spreading across the modern world despite intense academic skepticism. Because beneath all the speculation lies a terrifying possibility. What if humanity has forgotten most of its own past? Ancient people certainly believed that knowledge could disappear. In Sumerian literature, wisdom is repeatedly described as something transmitted from divine beings to humanity. Agriculture, writing, astronomy, law. The gods teach humans how civilization functions. This theme appears again in the story of the Me. The Me were sacred principles, or powers governing civilization itself. Not abstract morality, but practical foundations of culture. Kingship, craftsmanship, music, architecture, mathematics, scribeship. According to Sumerian myth, these powers originally belonged to Enki. Later, the goddess Inanna acquires them and brings them to humanity. Again, mainstream scholars interpret this symbolically, a mythological explanation for the spread of civilization. But the structure of the story feels strangely technological, as though knowledge itself was transferred, distributed, installed into human society. And perhaps that is why so many ancient myths portray civilization not as invention, but inheritance. Humanity does not discover knowledge. It receives it. This same idea echoes through cultures worldwide. Prometheus gives fire to humanity. Quetzalcoatl teaches writing and astronomy. Thoth brings wisdom to Egypt. The pattern repeats endlessly. Teachers descend. Knowledge spreads. The teachers leave. And eventually, the world declines. But if ancient myths are memories of contact with advanced beings, why did those beings disappear? Some theories suggest catastrophe forced their departure. Others propose deliberate withdrawal. Perhaps humanity was meant to develop independently after receiving an initial push toward civilization. Or perhaps the departure was never complete. That possibility terrifies people more than almost anything else, because hidden throughout history are strange moments where knowledge appears suddenly. Mathematics emerging centuries ahead of expectation. Monuments aligned with impossible precision. Maps depicting coastlines supposedly unknown at the time. Most historians explain these through human ingenuity, accumulated tradition, and coincidence. And again, they may be entirely correct. But alternative interpretations continue thriving because the gaps remain emotionally powerful. Human beings dislike uncertainty, and ancient history is filled with uncertainty, especially surrounding the sky. Because even now, modern astronomy continues discovering strange objects at the edge of the solar system. Dark bodies, rogue planets, interstellar visitors. In 2017, scientists detected Oumuamua, an object entering our solar system from interstellar space. Its behavior puzzled researchers immediately. Its acceleration did not fully match expectations. Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb even proposed the controversial possibility that it might represent artificial technology. Most scientists strongly disagreed, but the debate itself revealed something important. Humanity is entering an era where the impossible no longer feels entirely impossible. For thousands of years, ancient people looked upward and imagined gods descending from the heavens. Modern civilization looks upward and sees endless planets, countless star systems, and billions of potentially habitable worlds. The universe has become far stranger than ancient civilizations ever imagined, or perhaps closer to what they imagined than we want to admit. And if there truly are cycles hidden within history, if civilizations rise and collapse repeatedly, if knowledge can vanish and later return, then one final question becomes unavoidable. What exactly are we moving toward now? Because according to many ancient traditions, the return does not happen during peace. It happens during transition, during instability, during collapse, during the end of an age. And for the first time in modern history, a growing number of people believe humanity may already be entering one. Every civilization leaves behind ruins, but some ruins feel less like history, and more like evidence, not proof. Evidence, fragments of something unfinished, questions carved into stone. Because scattered across the world are places that continue to resist simple explanation, no matter how many times experts attempt to close the discussion. Massive structures, impossible precision, astronomical alignments, construction methods still debated centuries later. And strangely enough, many of these places are connected, directly or indirectly, to myths about beings descending from the heavens. Let us begin with one of the most unsettling sites on Earth, Baalbek, modern Lebanon. At first glance, Baalbek appears Roman. Towering temples dedicated to Jupiter, Bacchus, and Venus dominate the landscape. Historians agree these monumental structures were expanded under Roman rule roughly 2,000 years ago. But beneath the Roman complex lies something older, something enormous. At the foundation of the Temple of Jupiter sit 3 colossal stone blocks, known as the Trilithon. Each block weighs roughly 800 tons. To understand how absurd that number is, consider this. A modern blue whale weighs around 150 tons. These stones weigh several times more, and they are not simply lying on the ground. They were lifted and positioned with astonishing precision. Nearby, in an ancient quarry, rests an even larger unfinished stone. estimated at over 1,600 tons. One of the heaviest carved stones in human history. The question is unavoidable. How? Roman engineering was extraordinary, but even modern engineers struggle to fully explain the logistics of moving stones of such size without advanced machinery. Traditional explanations involve massive labor forces, ramps, rollers, ropes, leverage systems, and years of coordinated work. Technically possible, perhaps. But the deeper question remains strangely unresolved. Why build this way at all? Why not use smaller stones? Why create foundations so absurdly oversized that they challenge the capabilities of the civilization constructing them? Alternative theorists proposed dramatic answers. Some suggested Baalbek functioned as an ancient launch platform or landing site connected to the Anunnaki. Mainstream archaeology rejects these ideas entirely. And yet, the mystery itself survives, because Baalbek is not an isolated anomaly. Far away in Peru, another puzzle stretches across the desert floor. The Nazca lines, hundreds of gigantic geometric patterns and animal figures etched into the earth over immense distances. Monkeys, birds, spiders. Perfect straight lines running for kilometers. The strange part is not merely their scale, it is visibility. Most of the figures can only truly be understood from the sky. From ground level, they are nearly impossible to perceive in full. Why would ancient people create enormous artworks only visible from above? Conventional explanations suggest ritual pathways, astronomical markers, or symbolic offerings to gods observing from the heavens. Again, these explanations may be entirely correct, but the psychological effect remains powerful. Because human beings instinctively connect sky-oriented mysteries with the idea of watchers overhead, especially when ancient myths already describe beings descending from above. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, perhaps the most dangerous archaeological discovery ever made. Dangerous not because of what it proves, but because of what it destroys. Before Göbekli Tepe, historians believed large-scale organized religion emerged after agriculture and settled civilization. First came farming, then villages, then temples. Göbekli Tepe reversed the sequence entirely. The site dates back roughly 12,000 years. Its builders were supposedly hunter-gatherers, yet they carved enormous T-shaped pillars weighing many tons, decorated them with sophisticated reliefs of animals and symbols, arranged them into ceremonial circles, and then intentionally buried the entire complex. Carefully, deliberately, almost lovingly, as if preserving it for a future age. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt repeatedly admitted the site challenged conventional assumptions about early human civilization, because according to everything historians believed, people at that stage of history should not have been capable of such organization. But there it was, stone proving otherwise, and once again, the timing becomes deeply unsettling. Göbekli Tepe dates to the same broad era associated with catastrophic climate changes at the end of the Ice Age. The same era many ancient flood traditions point toward. The same era alternative researchers associate with the departure of the Anunnaki after global catastrophe. Coincidence? Possibly. But the coincidences continue accumulating. Even Egypt enters the discussion. The Great Sphinx of Giza may contain one of the most controversial geological mysteries in archaeology. Some researchers, including geologist Robert Schoch, argued that erosion patterns surrounding the Sphinx indicate prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Not desert wind. Rain. The problem is that Egypt has not experienced such climate conditions for thousands upon thousands of years. If Schoch's interpretation is correct, the Sphinx could be far older than traditionally believed, potentially dating back toward the end of the last Ice Age. Mainstream Egyptologists strongly reject this conclusion. The debate remains unresolved. But once again, ancient timelines begin to blur. And when timelines blur, forgotten possibilities emerge. This is what makes the Anunnaki theory psychologically addictive. It offers a single narrative capable of connecting countless historical mysteries into one enormous hidden story. Lost civilizations, ancient astronomy, megalithic structures, global flood myths, sudden technological leaps. Whether true or false, the theory creates coherence from uncertainty. And human beings crave coherence, especially during periods of instability, because modern civilization itself increasingly feels fragile. The more advanced humanity becomes, the more people realize how quickly systems can collapse. Supply chains fail. Power grids fail. Empires weaken. Climate shifts. Suddenly, ancient stories about cyclical collapse stop feeling primitive. They start feeling familiar. Perhaps that is why interest in ancient mysteries has exploded in recent decades. Not because people necessarily believe every theory, but because modern civilization has begun sensing its own vulnerability. Ancient ruins become mirrors, warnings left behind by forgotten ages. And hidden inside nearly all those warnings is the same terrifying idea. Humanity is not the first civilization to believe itself permanent. The Sumerians certainly did not think permanence existed. Everything moved in cycles. Kingdoms rose and vanished. Knowledge appeared and disappeared. The gods came and went, and according to some interpretations of the tablets, those cycles are not finished yet. Because if the Anunnaki truly promised to return, then perhaps the ruins scattered across Earth were never monuments to the past. Perhaps they were markers, left behind for the future. There is something deeply unsettling about ancient memory, not because it is unreliable, but because fragments of it keep surviving, across thousands of years, across collapsing empires, across oceans separating civilizations that supposedly never contacted one another. Again and again, humanity preserved the same core story. The gods were here once. They taught us. They ruled us. Then they vanished. And one day, they return. At first glance, these parallels seem easy to dismiss. Human beings share similar fears and hopes, so naturally myths repeat common themes. But the deeper researchers compare ancient traditions, the stranger the similarities become, especially regarding the beings themselves. In Mesopotamia, they were the Anunnaki. In Egypt, divine rulers governed during a lost primordial age called Zep Tepi, the first time. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl descended as a bringer of civilization before departing eastward across the sea. In India, the Devas interacted directly with humanity during earlier world ages. Even in Greece, gods regularly walked among mortals during older epochs before gradually withdrawing from the world. Different names, different cultures, yet repeatedly the same structure. Arrival, instruction, departure, promise of return. Carl Jung believed myths reflected universal psychological archetypes buried deep within the human unconscious. And perhaps he was right. But there is another possibility people rarely discuss. What if myths function less like fantasy and more like damaged memory? Not precise historical records, but distorted recollections of real events passed through thousands of years of oral tradition. That idea sounds speculative today, yet archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that myths sometimes preserve genuine history beneath their supernatural layers. For centuries, the city of Troy was considered fictional. Then Heinrich Schliemann excavated its ruins. The legend of King Minos and the labyrinth sounded impossible, until the palace complex at Knossos was uncovered on Crete. Again and again, stories dismissed as fantasy revealed hidden fragments of reality. Not literal reality, but memory transformed by time. And perhaps nowhere is this transformation more obvious than in the figure of Quetzalcoatl. The feathered serpent god of Mesoamerica was described as a civilizing force who taught humanity writing, astronomy, agriculture, and law. Then he departed. According to some traditions, he sailed eastward, promising one day to return. The parallels with the Anunnaki are difficult to ignore. Divine teachers descending from elsewhere, transmission of knowledge, withdrawal from humanity, the same emotional blueprint. Even stranger is how often these beings are associated with the sky. The Maya tracked celestial cycles obsessively. Egyptian pyramids aligned with stars. Mesopotamian priests studied planetary movement with astonishing precision. Why did so many ancient civilizations treat astronomy almost like sacred ritual? Because to them, the heavens were not merely decorative. They were connected to destiny, to cycles, to return. This becomes particularly eerie in Hindu cosmology. Ancient Indian texts describe vast repeating ages, called yugas. Humanity rises and falls through enormous cycles of spiritual and civilizational decline. At the end of the current Dark Age, the Kali Yuga, a returning figure known as Kalki restores order and begins a new cycle. Again, collapse, return, renewal. The same pattern. Always the same pattern. Even Norse mythology contains echoes of it. Ragnarok destroys the world of the gods through catastrophe and fire. Yet afterward, a new world rises from the sea. Surviving gods return. Humanity begins again. One world ending, another beginning. What makes this repetition psychologically powerful is not merely the stories themselves. It is timing. Because many ancient cultures believed they were living near the end of a cycle, and modern civilization increasingly feels the same way. Social instability, environmental anxiety, technological acceleration, global uncertainty. The modern world often feels like a civilization moving too quickly towards something unknown. Perhaps that is why ancient prophecies regain popularity during periods of collective fear. People search the past for warnings about the future, and hidden among those warnings are recurring references to watchers, observers, beings connected to the stars. One especially strange example comes from the biblical book of Enoch. Although not part of most official biblical canons, Enoch describes watchers descending from heaven before the flood. These beings teach forbidden knowledge to humanity: astronomy, metallurgy, weapons, secrets. Their actions corrupt the world and contribute to catastrophe. The similarities to Mesopotamian traditions are impossible to overlook. Many scholars believe these stories evolved from older Near Eastern mythologies, connected to the same cultural roots as Sumerian religion. Again, this does not prove extraterrestrials, but it demonstrates something deeply important. Ancient civilizations repeatedly associated advanced knowledge with non-human beings descending from the sky. Why? Perhaps because the heavens naturally inspired awe. Or perhaps because humanity inherited fragmented memories of teachers whose origins became mythologized over time. That uncertainty is precisely where the Anunnaki theory thrives. In uncertainty, not in proof. Proof rarely changes civilizations. Stories do. And the story of returning gods is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever told, because beneath all the ancient symbolism lies a fear modern people still carry. What if humanity is not entirely self-created? What if civilization itself was influenced by forces we barely understand? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what if those forces are cyclical? The Sumerians certainly believed cycles governed existence. Stars moved in cycles. Kings ruled in cycles. Civilizations rose and collapsed in cycles. Even the gods themselves followed cycles of presence and absence, which raises one final terrifying possibility. What if humanity unconsciously structures its own myths around return because something in our distant past truly did return more than once? A forgotten pattern repeating across thousands of years. A celestial clock humanity no longer fully understands. And if such a cycle exists, what happens when it reaches us again? What if the ancients were not predicting a single event, but describing a mechanism? That possibility changes everything, because most modern discussions about the Anunnaki focus on beings, gods, extraterrestrials, ancient visitors. But the deeper layer hidden inside many ancient traditions is not actually about entities. It is about cycles, predictable, repeating, celestial cycles. And according to some interpretations, humanity may be trapped inside one. The Sumerians believed the universe operated through order, not random order, mathematical order. The movements of stars, planets, seasons, floods, eclipses, kingship itself, all were expressions of larger cosmic patterns. To them, time was alive, and certain periods carried enormous significance. This becomes especially important when we examine how ancient civilizations treated catastrophe. Modern people tend to imagine disasters as isolated events, an earthquake, a flood, a war, temporary interruptions. But ancient cultures often viewed catastrophes as transitions between ages, the ending of one world, the beginning of another. And strangely enough, geology increasingly supports the idea that Earth truly experiences periodic upheavals. Ice ages advance and retreat. Magnetic fields weaken and recover. Mass extinctions arrive suddenly. Even the solar system itself may not be stable over extremely long periods. Comets return. Asteroids cross Earth's orbit. Celestial objects drift through deep space on cycles lasting thousands of years. The universe moves rhythmically, and ancient civilizations watched those rhythms obsessively. One of the strangest examples comes from the precession of the equinoxes. As Earth slowly wobbles on its axis, the position of constellations gradually shifts over enormous periods of time. This full cycle takes nearly 26,000 years. Ancient cultures encoded this movement symbolically. The age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces. Different world ages connected to celestial transitions. But here is the unsettling part. Detecting precession requires observations spanning many centuries, possibly thousands of years. How did ancient civilizations discover it? Some historians argue the knowledge accumulated gradually through priestly observation. Others believe fragments of astronomical understanding may have survived from cultures older than recorded history itself. And then there are the anomalies, ancient maps depicting coastlines supposedly unknown at the time, mathematical systems appearing fully formed, megalithic structures aligned with celestial events requiring extraordinary precision. Individually, each mystery may have ordinary explanations. Collectively, they create tension, the sense that something is missing from the official story. This is exactly where theories about the Anunnaki and Nibiru become psychologically powerful, because they offer a hidden framework connecting scattered mysteries into one narrative. A civilization before civilization, a forgotten catastrophe, a celestial cycle, returning watchers from the sky. Again, none of this is proof, but stories do not survive thousands of years unless they touch something emotionally fundamental inside humanity. And perhaps the most fundamental fear of all is repetition. That history does not progress upward forever. That civilizations rise, peak, decline, and disappear. The Roman Empire believed itself eternal. So did countless others. Now they exist as ruins. The Sumerians understood this deeply. Their texts constantly emphasize impermanence. Cities rise and fall according to divine cycles. Kings receive temporary authority from heaven before losing it again. Floods erase entire ages. Everything passes. Everything returns. Even the gods. One particularly fascinating idea appears in later Mesopotamian traditions involving celestial omens. Ancient priests believed unusual movements in the heavens signaled transitions on Earth. Comets, eclipses, planetary alignments. The sky reflected destiny. To modern people, this may sound superstitious, but psychologically, the connection still exists. Even today, humanity reacts emotionally to the heavens. a bright comet appears, and millions feel unease. An asteroid passes close to Earth, and headlines spread instantly. Deep down, human beings still associate the sky with uncertainty, perhaps because ancient memory never fully disappeared. And now, modern astronomy is revealing just how chaotic the cosmos truly is. Rogue planets drifting without stars, interstellar objects crossing our solar system, potentially habitable worlds numbering in the billions. The universe is not calm. It is dynamic, violent, unpredictable, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if ancient civilizations experienced real astronomical disasters severe enough to permanently shape human memory? Not symbolic floods, actual cataclysms, massive climate collapse, impacts from space, global destruction encoded into mythology over thousands of years. If so, then myths about returning gods may actually preserve cultural memory of recurring celestial events, not necessarily extraterrestrials, but cycles tied to the heavens. And perhaps that is why the line between astronomy and religion remained blurred for so long in ancient civilizations. Because survival itself depended on understanding the sky. The stars were not entertainment. They were warning systems, calendars, prophecies, and according to some interpretations, schedules. This idea becomes especially eerie when connected to the modern search for Planet 9. Again, no evidence links Planet 9 to Nibiru. None. But the symbolism matters psychologically. For thousands of years, humanity imagined a hidden celestial body associated with cycles of upheaval and return. Now, modern astronomers are actively searching for an undiscovered massive object at the edge of the solar system. The overlap feels almost mythic, as though ancient fears are slowly re-entering scientific conversation under different names. And perhaps that is why the story of the Anunnaki refuses to disappear, despite endless criticism. Because beneath all the debates about translations, archaeology, and astronomy lies a deeper anxiety. The fear that humanity does not fully understand the forces shaping its own history. Civilizations appear suddenly. Knowledge vanishes mysteriously. Global systems become fragile. The modern world feels increasingly unstable, while ancient stories quietly whisper the same warning over and over again. This has happened before. Maybe not exactly like this. Maybe not literally. But civilizations have stood at the edge of uncertainty before. And according to the oldest traditions, those moments of transition are when the Watchers return. Not necessarily as invaders, not necessarily as saviors, but as part of the cycle itself. And if the cycle is real, then perhaps the most important question is no longer whether the Anunnaki existed, but whether humanity is approaching another turning point in the pattern they supposedly left behind. There is a possibility far more unsettling than the return of the Anunnaki. The possibility that they never truly left, not physically, not completely, but through influence, through systems, through knowledge, through the invisible architecture of civilization itself. Because one detail hidden inside ancient mythology is often overlooked. The gods do not simply teach humanity technology. They teach structure, government, agriculture, law, measurement, writing, timekeeping. In other words, they teach civilization how to function independently, almost like parents preparing children to survive alone, or administrators stabilizing a long-term project before departure. This idea becomes especially eerie when reading Sumerian texts describing the distribution of knowledge across humanity. The gods assign responsibilities, divide territories, establish systems of order. Civilization is not portrayed as chaotic discovery. It feels organized, engineered. And perhaps that is why modern readers sometimes describe these myths as sounding strangely technological. Not because ancient people literally understood advanced science, but because their stories repeatedly frame knowledge as transferred from above, installed into human culture. This pattern appears in nearly every ancient civilization. The Egyptians said wisdom came from Thoth. The Greeks credited Prometheus with giving fire and knowledge to humanity. The Maya described divine teachers connected to the heavens. The message remains remarkably consistent. Humanity was taught, not entirely self-created, and that possibility touches a very deep psychological nerve. Because modern civilization prides itself on independence. We believe humanity climbed upward through its own effort alone. Yet ancient traditions repeatedly insist that civilization began with intervention, guidance, instruction from something beyond ordinary humanity. Whether symbolic or literal, the emotional effect remains powerful, especially when modern technology itself begins resembling ancient myths in disturbing ways. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, global surveillance systems, planetary communication networks. Humanity increasingly behaves like a civilization acquiring godlike tools before fully understanding itself. And perhaps that is why interest in ancient visitors grows strongest during technological revolutions, because modern people unconsciously recognize something ancient civilizations feared deeply. Knowledge changes species. The Sumerians certainly viewed knowledge as dangerous. Many myths describe divine conflict surrounding humanity's access to power and understanding. In some stories, gods restrict knowledge. In others, certain beings secretly share it. Again, the similarities to later traditions become impossible to ignore. Prometheus punished for giving fire to humans. The Watchers condemned for teaching forbidden arts. Adam and Eve transformed through forbidden knowledge. The pattern repeats endlessly. Civilization itself is treated almost like stolen fire, a gift humanity was not fully prepared to receive. And perhaps that is the hidden fear underneath the Anunnaki narrative. Not merely that advanced beings existed, but that humanity may still be shaped by forces set in motion long ago. Even modern geopolitics occasionally feels strangely mythological when viewed from enough distance. Empires competing for resources, elites controlling information, technological acceleration beyond ethical control. The world increasingly resembles systems operating at scales ordinary people barely comprehend. And ancient myths repeatedly describe humanity living beneath powers it could not fully see. Perhaps that is why conspiracy theories surrounding the Anunnaki became so widespread in the modern era, not because everyone literally believes in ancient astronauts, but because the story expresses a deeper, emotional truth. The feeling that civilization itself may not entirely belong to us. That invisible systems guide history in ways most people never fully understand. And perhaps that fear intensified because modern science keeps revealing how small humanity truly is. For centuries, people believed Earth stood at the center of existence. Now we know our planet is one world, orbiting one star among hundreds of billions, inside one galaxy among trillions. The scale is overwhelming. Suddenly, ancient ideas about visitors from elsewhere no longer feel absurd in the same way they once did. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, and statistically many scientists believe it almost certainly does, then the possibility of contact becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. Again, no evidence proves ancient extraterrestrial visitation. None. But humanity now lives in a universe where such things are no longer scientifically impossible. And once possibility enters the human imagination, stories evolve rapidly, especially stories already buried inside ancient memory. This brings us back to one final disturbing detail found across countless traditions. The gods return during periods of transition, not stability. Collapse. The flood arrives when humanity becomes corrupted. Ragnarok arrives during moral decay. The Kali Yuga ends in chaos before renewal begins. Again and again, civilizations describe endings before transformation. and modern humanity increasingly feels itself approaching some kind of threshold. Environmental instability, political fragmentation, artificial intelligence transforming labor and thought itself, economic systems straining globally. For the first time in centuries, large numbers of people sense that the current world order may not be permanent. Ancient fears are returning alongside modern uncertainty. Perhaps that is why stories about the Anunnaki resonate so deeply online. Not because people necessarily expect spaceships descending from the clouds, but because modern civilization itself feels like it is approaching a transition point humanity cannot fully predict. And transitions awaken old myths, especially myths about return, because psychologically, the idea of returning gods represents something larger than extraterrestrials. It represents judgment, reckoning, the possibility that humanity's progress may one day be measured against forces older and more advanced than ourselves. The Sumerians certainly feared divine judgment. Their texts repeatedly describe civilizations collapsing after losing harmony with cosmic order. Cities become corrupt. Kings become arrogant. Balance breaks. Then catastrophe follows. Whether interpreted spiritually, psychologically, or literally, the message remains chillingly timeless. Civilizations are fragile. Human beings forget this during periods of comfort. But ancient ruins remember. Broken temples, flooded cities, buried monuments beneath deserts and oceans. Every lost civilization once believed its world would continue forever. And perhaps that is the true reason stories of the Anunnaki never disappear. Because deep down, humanity senses something ancient civilizations understood very clearly. Nothing built by human hands lasts forever. Not kingdoms, not empires, not even memory itself. Only the cycle continues. And according to the oldest stories humanity ever wrote, the cycle may already be turning once again. Maybe the greatest mystery is not whether the Anunnaki were real. Maybe the greatest mystery is why humanity cannot stop remembering them. Across thousands of years, through collapsing empires, burned libraries, erased languages, and shattered civilizations, the story survived. Not perfectly. Fragments only. Broken tablets, half-erased myths, ruins buried beneath sand and oceans. And yet the pattern endured. The gods came from the heavens. They brought knowledge. They ruled for an age. Then they departed. And one day, they return. Perhaps it is only mythology. Perhaps ancient people simply looked at the stars and imagined powerful beings watching from above. That would be the safest explanation, the most comfortable. But comfort is not always the same thing as truth, because when we step back and examine the full picture, something strange emerges. Ancient texts describing beings descending from the sky, civilizations appearing suddenly with astonishing knowledge, global flood traditions preserved across continents, megalithic structures that still challenge explanation, astronomical cycles hidden inside mythological systems, and modern science slowly uncovering evidence that human history may be older, more fragile, and more catastrophic than we once believed. Individually, none of these prove the existence of the Anunnaki. Together, they create unease, a feeling that humanity may be missing part of its own story. And perhaps that is why these ancient narratives continue haunting modern civilization. Not because they provide certainty, but because they expose uncertainty. For centuries, humanity believed history was simple. Primitive beginnings, steady progress, modern superiority. Now that certainty is collapsing. Archaeology keeps pushing civilization further into the past. Astronomy keeps revealing how enormous and chaotic the universe truly is. Technology keeps accelerating faster than human psychology can comfortably process. Modern civilization suddenly feels less permanent than it once did. And in moments like that, ancient voices become louder, especially the Sumerians. Because unlike many mythological traditions, The Sumerians wrote like administrators documenting reality. They named cities, recorded measurements, tracked kings, mapped stars. They were systematic, practical, obsessed with order, which makes their repeated references to heavenly beings so difficult to dismiss emotionally. When kingship descended from heaven. That sentence survives on clay older than most nations on Earth, and no matter how scholars interpret it, the phrase remains deeply haunting. Descended from heaven. Perhaps the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote, or perhaps they were describing spiritual truths through symbolic language we no longer understand. Either way, the effect is the same. The story endures. And maybe that endurance itself matters, because myths survive for reasons. Some preserve fear, some preserve hope, some preserve memory, and some may preserve warnings. There is another possibility few people consider. What if the Anunnaki story is not really about extraterrestrials at all? What if it is humanity trying to explain the terrifying realization that civilization itself is fragile? That knowledge can vanish, that entire worlds can disappear beneath water and sand, that empires collapse faster than they believe possible. In that sense, the gods may symbolize something far more unsettling than literal beings from another planet. They may symbolize lost ages of humanity itself, forgotten civilizations remembered only as divine, advanced ancestors transformed into gods by the distortion of time. That possibility would explain many things. It would explain why ancient myths blur the line between gods and kings, why divine beings behave so politically and humanly, why flood myths feel emotionally historical rather than purely fantastical. Perhaps the gods were not aliens. Perhaps they were echoes, distorted memories of a world humanity can no longer fully remember. Or perhaps the ancient texts are more literal than modern civilization is comfortable admitting. We do not know. And intellectual honesty requires saying those words clearly. We do not know. Not truly. No final proof exists. No hidden tablet resolves the mystery. No telescope has found Nibiru crossing the sky. No archaeologist has uncovered undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial rule in ancient Mesopotamia. Only fragments, patterns, questions. But questions matter. Because questions are what drive humanity forward. The same curiosity that caused ancient priests to study the stars now drives modern astronomers to search the outer darkness of the solar system. The same fear of catastrophe that shaped flood myths now drives scientists studying climate collapse and asteroid impacts. The same fascination with origins that filled clay tablets now fills laboratories, observatories, and archaeological excavations around the world. Humanity has always searched the sky for answers, and perhaps that instinct itself is ancient, older than civilization, older than memory. Maybe somewhere deep inside the human mind remains the faint imprint of something our ancestors once believed with absolute certainty. That we were not alone. And perhaps that is why the story of the Anunnaki refuses to die. Because regardless of whether the gods were real, symbolic, misunderstood, or entirely imagined, the fear hidden inside the story remains timeless. The fear that humanity may not be the final chapter of Earth's history. Only one cycle among many. One civilization rising briefly between forgotten ages. And if the ancient texts are even partially correct, then somewhere beyond the edge of human memory, beyond the ruins, beyond the stars themselves, the cycle is still moving, quietly, patiently, waiting.